What if the oldest secret in human history is not about how life began, but about who first learned to refuse its ending? What if somewhere in the buried layers of our shared past, there existed a civilization that looked at the great unblinking face of death and simply decided not to bow? And if such beings once walked this earth without the weight of finitude pressing down on their shoulders, then why is there no trace of them now? Why does the world feel as if it's haunted not by their presence, but by the shape of an absence so immense it bends everything around it? Imagine standing at the edge of a desert at night. The air is still. The stars burn like old memories, and beneath your feet lie fragments of civilizations that rose and fractured long before our earliest recorded line of history. Wind buries their stories, time erases their architecture, but something deeper, something older, refuses to truly disappear. There are whispers in myths, anomalies in bones, contradictions in archaeology that hint at a possibility humanity has never dared to examine fully. That death was once optional, a problem solved, a boundary crossed by minds who understood nature in a way we no longer do. Some ancient texts speak of people who did not return to dust, whose bodies remained untouched by decay even after centuries. Legends from different continents, isolated by geography, separated by oceans, describe luminous beings with human shapes but ageless eyes, leaving footprints that lasted longer than their cities. Civilizations that should have been strangers somehow repeated the same symbols of eternity. Spirals carved into stone, circles intersecting in patterns too precise for coincidence, depictions of figures standing at the edge of time itself. Why does the world remember this story the same way a dream remembers a sleeper? Why does the idea of immortality feel less like fantasy and more like something buried, suppressed, perhaps even intentionally erased? As you listen, I want you to imagine not a supernatural world, but a scientifically expanded one. Biology as we know it is only one version of what life can be. Time is not as rigid as we pretend. Entropy is not as undefeatable as our textbooks claim. In quantum systems, particles resist aging. In extremophiles, DNA repairs itself endlessly. In theoretical physics, time is not a river but a landscape, and some paths simply do not decay. What if an ancient civilization discovered these truths long before we ever articulated them? What if they reached the edges of their mortality and realized that the universe had left a hidden door unlocked? But every door opened changes what stands behind it. Archaeologists have found bones that refuse to match the timeline of surrounding artifacts, skulls that appear thousands of years older than the soil they were discovered in, bones that show healing far too rapid for the medical capabilities of their time, remains that resist decomposition in ways we still cannot replicate. Most are dismissed as contamination or misdating, but what if they are fragments of a forgotten species, or rather, a forgotten version of us? A branch of humanity that took a different path through evolution? Imagine them discovering that aging is not a fate but a mechanism, telomeres that need not shorten, cells that do not accumulate errors but rewrite themselves with perfect fidelity, a body that learns to refresh instead of collapse, a mind that remembers centuries instead of decades. Imagine the psychological horizon of such a being, living long enough to watch mountains shift and rivers alter their course, to witness civilizations rise and crumble, to understand the rhythms of the world the way we understand the beating of our own hearts. And yet, if such a people existed, why do we not find their cities, their writings, their monuments made of materials beyond erosion? Why is their existence only hinted at in riddles, symbols, and anomalies, scattered like breadcrumbs across the continents? There is a strange pattern in the ruins of ancient settlements, places where no burial grounds are found, where no funerary rituals were practiced, where architecture is arranged not around life and death, but around light, resonance, and time. These places feel less like cities, and more like laboratories for existence itself. They were built to endure, yet they were abandoned all at once, as if a silent signal echoed across the world, and every eternal being listened, paused, and vanished. Legends tell us they walked into the sky, stepped across the sun, entered the place behind the horizon. These are poetic translations, but beneath them lies a chilling possibility. They did not die, they departed. But from what? And to where? What force could drive immortals to flee a world they had mastered? What danger grows only for those who live too long? Physics tells us that longevity isn't just biological, it's quantum. A consciousness that remains coherent for too long becomes unstable. Memory corrupts, identity fractures. Entropy does not simply give up, it adapts. Perhaps the very laws of the universe are hostile to beings who attempt to outrun time. Or perhaps something older than the universe itself awakens when life persists beyond its natural interval. There are stories from Siberia, Africa, South America, warnings written in symbols older than writing. Stories of the devourer of the endless, a presence that hunts those who step beyond their allotted lifespan. Could these be metaphors for entropy? Or were they descriptions of something conscious, something that seeks equilibrium by consuming outliers? The thought that immortality may attract predators the way light attracts moths is terrifying and strangely logical. If the universe maintains balance, then beings who refuse decay may disrupt that balance enough to trigger a reaction. There are also descriptions of rifts, portals, passages not through space, but through time. Ancient cave paintings show figures walking into geometric patterns that look eerily similar to modern depictions of higher dimensional wormholes. These images are not symbolic. They have ratios, angles, and repetitions that match mathematical structures we only began to understand in the last century. What if immortals discovered a way to slip into the deeper architecture of reality, leaving behind this fragile, decaying world for one where time behaves differently? And if they stepped into such a place, what did they expect to find there? Safety? Rebirth? Escape? Or were they running from something they themselves had unleashed? Think about the unsettling possibility that immortality was not a serene, godlike existence, but a slow psychological disintegration. Imagine centuries passing until memories blur into a single suffocating mass. Imagine outliving every identity you ever formed. Imagine the weight of an eternity pressing so hard against your mind that you no longer remember the person you once were. Immortality may have been their salvation at first, then their curse, and finally their prison. Perhaps they sought a new dimension simply to forget. Yet the most haunting question remains. Why do we dream of immortality as if we once had it? Why does the idea feel like a memory rather than an invention? Why do we carry myths of eternal beings in every culture, as if some buried part of our species remembers something the conscious mind does not? And if this civilization truly vanished, why does it feel like they left something behind? Not technology, not monuments, but a warning. The old legends do not say they died. They say they passed a threshold and closed it behind them, leaving signs for us not to follow. But humanity, restless and curious, is once again approaching the edge of that threshold. We are reversing aging at the cellular level, freezing time in biological systems, manipulating the quantum fields that govern existence. We are stepping onto the same path that they walked thousands of years ago. So, the question becomes unavoidable. When we finally break the last barrier between life and endless life, will we suffer their fate? Will we attract the same unseen force? Will we feel the same fracture of the self? Or will we discover the same doorway and find out where they went? Somewhere, across deserts, mountains, oceans, beneath ruins and within forgotten texts, fragments of their story wait for us to assemble them. Not to repeat their journey, but to understand why no immortal civilization remains. Every civilization leaves ruins. Only one left none. And that absence is the loudest evidence of all. We stand at the threshold they once crossed, staring into an ancient silence that feels like it's staring back. What waits on the other side of immortality? What price did they pay? And why does it feel like their story is not finished, only paused, waiting for us to turn the same key? Tell me when you're ready, and we will step deeper into the next part of the mystery. What if every ancient culture that ever touched the idea of immortality wasn't dreaming, but remembering? As we step deeper into the forgotten layers of human history, a strange pattern emerges. One so persistent, so globally synchronized, that it suggests something far more deliberate than myth-making. It suggests a memory, fractured across continents, echoing through civilizations that should never have shared a story. It is here, in these echoes, that we find the strange archives of longevity, maps, scrolls, artifacts that whisper of lives lasting far beyond the limits of flesh. But these hints do not appear in the obvious places. They are not carved into royal tombs or grand temples. They exist in the margins, in the anomalies, in the fragments that historians prefer not to examine closely because they do not fit into the comforting shape of accepted history. Yet the deeper we look, the more impossible it becomes to dismiss them. Think of the Sumerian king list, a document so ancient it predates most languages we speak today. It records rulers who reigned not for decades, but for thousands of years. Scholars call these exaggerations symbolic inflations of power. But what if they are documents of a lineage that mastered longevity before writing even existed? What if the numbers were not metaphors, but measurements? Or consider the Yellow Emperor of China, described as living over a century and continuing his existence in realms beyond physical reality. The legends say he withdrew from the world to perfect the science of life, alone, meditating on the machinery of his own biology. Then one day, he vanished, dissolving into a beam of light that lifted him into the heavens. It reads like myth, until you realize how many cultures repeat the same detail: the moment of dissolution, the transformation of matter into something unseen. Why do these stories match so precisely across civilizations that were never in contact? Why do they describe not resurrection, but transition, movement from one state of existence into another? Could these accounts be distorted memories of a single ancient source, a map scattered across eras? As we examine these cultural fragments, a new question forms. What if immortality was not only discovered, but taught? What if the techniques, rituals, and formulas woven into ancient traditions came from a civilization that tried desperately to leave behind instructions, scripts that became poems, diagrams that became symbols, technologies that became mythology? Let's step into the remains of Egypt, where inscriptions describe beings with bones of iron and sinews of water, individuals who could live through dynasties without weakening. Priests whispered that some gods walked among them, not divine spirits, but perfected humans who mastered the art of stasis, pausing the slow decay that defines mortal life. Even the architecture reflects this obsession. Pyramids aligned with stellar cycles, lasting thousands of years, structures designed to outlive every memory of their creators. These were not monuments to the dead. They were attempts at permanence created by those who feared the world would not remember them after they vanished. The farther we look, the stranger the pattern becomes. In the Andes, mummified bodies have been found with tissues so preserved that modern scientists still cannot fully explain the absence of cellular breakdown. Some bodies remain flexible, as if time simply refused to touch them. The locals once spoke of night travelers, beings who did not age, who appeared and disappeared without warning. One legend says they were not born of this time. Another says they watched the movements of the stars more carefully than the movements of people. Across the ocean, in India, texts describe siddhas, immortal beings who withdrew to remote mountains because their presence disrupted the rhythm of ordinary life. In Greece, philosophers wrote of ageless titans and heroes whose existence defied nature, whose stories were fragments of something older than language. In Africa, oral traditions speak of tribes who lived through 10 eras, who left behind no graves, no bones, only sudden absences. These ancient pieces, scattered as they are, trace the outline of a story that humanity seems desperate to forget, and yet unable to fully erase. Each fragment is a puzzle piece from a forgotten blueprint. Each legend is a cracked window into a lost science. But maps of longevity take many forms. Not just stories, but artifacts with properties as baffling as the beings they describe. Consider the stones found in a collapsed cave in Mongolia, each etched with symbols repeating at perfect intervals, as if the creator understood mathematics in a way we only rediscovered millennia later. The stones are smooth, untouched by erosion, despite being buried for thousands of years. Some believe they were tools for meditation. Others think they were devices for aligning human consciousness with cosmic cycles. But what if they were not tools at all? What if they were records, encoded instructions for maintaining a body outside the decay of time? There are scrolls in China that outline breathing techniques so intricate they resemble formulas rather than rituals. Their diagrams show energy moving through the body like currents, circulating in loops that could theoretically slow biological aging. Modern science has begun to validate fragments of these teachings. Deep breathing affects telomere length, Meditation stabilizes cellular coherence. But the texts hint at something far deeper, as if their authors understood biology at the level of vibration, not chemistry. Imagine a civilization where longevity was not a luxury, but a shared practice, refined through generations of experimentation. A society that treated death not as a destiny, but as a challenge to overcome. A culture for whom time was not a predator, but an ally. But if such a society existed, how did its knowledge vanish so completely? Why did the maps that once guided their survival dissolve into fragments of superstition and half-remembered rituals? There is a disturbing detail hidden in these ancient records. Many scrolls, carvings, and manuscripts do not simply end. They break. They stop mid-sentence, mid-diagram, mid-instruction, as if someone or something interrupted their writing, as if the knowledge was being erased in real time. Archaeologists find places where carvings were deliberately scratched out, where symbols were shattered, where libraries were burned long before they could be read. This destruction appears in civilizations that never met, separated by oceans and continents. And strangely, the timeline of destructions clusters around certain periods, as if the world itself was trying to silence a dangerous truth. It's almost as if the knowledge of immortality was not lost, but removed, hidden, suppressed, not by one culture, but by something larger, something that existed above the movements of civilizations. If the immortals taught humanity how to live beyond decay, why would that knowledge need to be erased? Did something go wrong? Did the pursuit of longevity risk destabilizing more than just biology? Did it threaten the structure of time itself? Imagine a civilization that discovered a method to anchor consciousness across centuries, a technique that allowed them to accumulate knowledge in ways we cannot comprehend. Such beings would quickly outgrow the constraints of ordinary societies. Their perspective would transcend politics, economics, even empathy as we understand it. The world might begin to reshape itself around their perceptions, pulling humanity into a cycle it wasn't meant to survive. Perhaps immortality was never meant for a species still struggling to understand itself. Perhaps the ancient mentors realized, too late, that the gift they offered would fracture the human psyche before it matured. The abrupt endings in texts, the destroyed artifacts, the erasures, they feel less like accidents and more like a controlled shutdown, a withdrawal. But there is another possibility, darker and more unsettling. What if the destructions were not done to protect us, but to protect themselves? What if revealing their existence or the mechanisms behind their longevity attracted a force they feared? Something that hunts the unnatural, something that seeks balance, something that consumes anomalies? If immortality was a light, perhaps it drew something to it. And in desperation, the civilization erased its own fingerprints to survive. Maps of forbidden longevity then become more than clues. They become warnings. Tattered instructions left behind by a species that realized it had gone too far. Their disappearance may not be a mystery, but an escape. And yet, here we are. Modern science once again touches the same boundaries they crossed. We manipulate DNA, halt aging in organisms, extend lifespan through gene editing. And somewhere in the ancient silence, the same hidden pattern stirs, waiting for us to open a door that was closed for a reason. So, we follow these maps carefully, knowing that every discovery pulls us closer to a truth the ancients tried to hide. And we must ask ourselves, are we uncovering their lost wisdom or retracing their final mistake? What if the evolution of humanity is not a straight line, but a fractured mirror, one shard reflecting the beings we became and another reflecting the beings we were supposed to be? As we move deeper into the labyrinth of this mystery, the question begins to twist into something far more fragile, far more unsettling. What if humanity once had companions on this planet, brothers of the same origin, branches of the same tree, but they stepped off the timeline long before we learned to call ourselves modern? Imagine going back tens of thousands of years to a planet still waking from ice, where climates shifted violently and humanity wandered like sparks blown across continents. In that era, there were other humans, archaic species like Neanderthals, Denisovans, and branches yet unnamed. But what if there was one lineage so unusual, so aberrant, that it refused to stay confined within the cages of biology? A lineage whose evolution didn't just slow aging, but severed its dependence on it? When scientists first discovered the Denisovan bone fragments in a Siberian cave, they were shocked by its density. thicker than modern humans, almost unnaturally reinforced. But most of all, they were puzzled by a pattern that did not match anything in known evolutionary lines. Something in that genome looked like it came from a population even older, even deeper, a group we still cannot identify. It was a ghost hidden inside a ghost, a hint of a lineage that touched humanity and then vanished. But fragments like this appear all over the world. Bones in South America with mineral compositions that resist decay as if the cells themselves petrified without breaking. Teeth from Central Asia that show signs of regrowing enamel in adulthood, a feature no human species should possess. Skeletal remains in Africa with joints that appear to have healed perfectly even after catastrophic injury. These anomalies are often dismissed as coincidences, as artifacts of environment or preservation. But what if they were not? What if they were the biological fingerprints of a lost branch of humanity, one that learned to repair itself, adapt itself, and eventually transcend the vulnerability we call mortality? Consider this. Evolution is not always gradual. Sometimes it leaps. In rare cases, mutations align in perfect harmony, forming adaptations so powerful that they reshape the trajectory of an entire species. Why should it be impossible that at some point in prehistory, a population emerged with traits that modern science would consider impossible? Faster healing, slower aging, enhanced cellular repair, greater resistance to environmental stress, higher neural plasticity. These would not merely extend life, they would reshape perception, memory, identity. A mind that lives for centuries does not think like a mind that lives for decades. Now, imagine those beings watching early humanity struggle with survival, disease, hunger, fear. Would they intervene? Would they teach us? Or would they remain silent observers, guided by a deeper understanding of time? And if they existed, even for a brief evolutionary moment, how would their disappearance reshape the world? There are myths describing beings who came from caves, from mountains, from deep forests, figures who taught early humans how to find water, how to use fire, how to read the stars. These stories appear in Aboriginal Australia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, and in each story, the teachers leave suddenly, always with the same warning. We must learn to carry time without seeking to control it. But warnings are only valuable when remembered. Humanity forgot. Or perhaps forgetting was imposed upon us. In the frozen tunnels of Denisova Cave, scientists found not only bones and tools, but fingerprints from a child who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Yet, the strange thing was not the age, it was the size. The prints were far too small for the body of the adolescent they were found next to, suggesting individuals whose growth did not follow the expected pattern. Some researchers quietly proposed that the child and the adult might belong to beings whose development did not adhere to linear aging. Others argued that the fingerprints were left centuries apart, even though they lay in the same layer of sediment. But sediment does not lie. Something else does. What if these beings aged irregularly, staying childlike for decades, then shifting into adulthood only when necessary? What if age was not a countdown, but a choice? The deeper we look, the stranger it becomes. In Peru's high-altitude caves, mummified remains show signs of repeated healing cycles, bones fractured and repaired multiple times with near-perfect alignment. In one case, a rib appears to have been broken at least 7 times, yet each healing left almost no scar tissue. This kind of regeneration is not human. It is something else, something that suggests a body designed not for slow decay, but for continual refinement. Even modern science nods toward the possibility. Jellyfish that revert to their juvenile forms, organisms that replicate their cells without error, life that loops instead of falling forward. Evolution is capable of miracles. We simply do not see them often enough to believe in them. Now, consider a civilization emerging from such beings. A people who do not fear time, who do not measure life in years, but in moments of transformation. Their concept of childhood, of adulthood, of aging would be alien to us. A fluid identity that shifts with purpose, not with biology. Their wisdom would accumulate across centuries. Their emotions would shape differently. Their urgency would fade. Their patience deepen into something we might mistake for divinity. Would such beings have built cities? Perhaps not. Would they have left monuments? Maybe only those aligned with cosmic patterns. Would they have written texts? If they lived long enough, they may have preserved knowledge through memory alone. Their greatest structures may have been invisible, their minds, their bodies, their way of existing between moments. Yet, the question remains, if such beings were real, where did they go? Why do we find only fragments, anomalies, bones that do not fit? Some scientists propose that they interbred with humans and were absorbed into our species. But this theory collapses when we examine the sudden disappearance of certain genomic markers, patterns that appear in early human populations, and then vanish abruptly. It is as if a lineage was carefully removed, erased from the gene pool with deliberate precision. Evolution does not behave that neatly. Nature does not delete without leaving behind scars. What if they did not vanish through death, but through departure? What if their evolutionary journey diverged so dramatically that staying in our world became impossible? Perhaps the world itself changed, a shift in magnetic fields, climate, cosmic radiation. Environmental factors could destabilize a species adapted to a different kind of time. Or perhaps they chose to leave, withdrawing from humanity as our numbers grew, as our aggression intensified, as our hunger for control became a threat, not only to ourselves, but to them. Imagine a people who lived for centuries, observing the rise of tribes, the birth of language, the spread of walls, the beginning of war. How long would it take before they realized they no longer belonged in the world humanity was building? And how long before their presence became dangerous, not for us, but for them? Some myths say they retreated underground. Some say they built sanctuaries in mountains we rarely climb. Others say they stepped into a realm that coexists alongside ours, but vibrates at a different frequency, barely perceptible except in moments when the world grows thin, like twilight or dream. What if their disappearance was not a tragedy, but a transition? What if they simply stopped evolving in the physical sense and began evolving in another dimension of existence, and the anomalies we find, the bones, the artifacts, the inexplicable healing, are remnants from the final generation that still walked among us? This idea seems impossible until we consider that modern physics acknowledges dimensions beyond our perception. There are states of matter and consciousness we have not yet learned to detect. What if these beings found a way to shift into such a state? Not death, not ascension, something in between. But here is the most unsettling part. Why do traces of their biology appear again in rare individuals today? Why do some humans heal faster, age slower, think differently, feel time moving through them in ways they cannot explain? Are these echoes of that ancient lineage, or mutations reawakening as the world once again approaches boundaries we were warned not to cross? Humanity is on the brink of manipulating its own evolution, genetic editing, life extension, neural enhancement. We are replicating through science what those beings may have achieved through evolution. And if their disappearance was triggered by stepping too close to the edge of time, then we are walking toward that same precipice with accelerating speed. The interrupted evolution of humanity is not just a mystery about the past, it is a mirror held up to our future. If a branch of humanity once reached immortality and vanished, then perhaps immortality is not a destination, but a departure point, a threshold, and thresholds are not crossed without consequence. What if time is not the river we've always believed it to be, but a vast unmapped landscape, one with valleys where moments slow to a crawl, ridges where hours stretch thin, and hidden corridors where entire lifetimes can pass without leaving a trace on the surface? If so, then perhaps the ancient civilization we're chasing didn't simply overcome death. Perhaps they discovered the far more unsettling truth, that immortality is not the absence of ending, but a shift in how one moves through the fabric of time itself. Imagine staring at your reflection in a window just as the sun sets. For a few seconds, your face blends with the fading sky, creating two overlapping realities. One inside the glass, one outside. Now, imagine a being who lives permanently in that between space, neither fully in our world nor entirely beyond it. A being who has learned to slip into the hours that don't exist for the rest of us, the fractions of seconds that stretch like hidden rooms behind the ticking of a clock. These might have been the so-called immortals, not eternal by biology alone, but by inhabiting a different rhythm of existence. Modern physics tells us that time is flexible. Near the speed of light, it slows. Under intense gravity, it bends. At quantum scales, it refuses to behave at all. Time is not a universal experience, it is a localized condition. But what if a civilization learned to access pockets of time where biological decay pauses, where entropy hesitates, where consciousness can drift across centuries without suffering the burden of age? Such a society would not just live longer, they would live differently. Their memories would not fragment, their identities would not collapse, their perspectives would not be compressed into narrow decades. They would become something new entirely, travelers of duration rather than prisoners of it. In caves across the world, there are carvings that show humans standing beside shapes that resemble spirals, loops, intersecting circles, geometric representations of time rather than space. Some depict figures entering these spirals, while others show them emerging, altered, elongated, surrounded by patterns that imply transformation. Could these be symbolic depictions of a technique, a practice, or even a technology that allowed these ancient beings to step into altered timelines? Consider the paradox of relativity. Time for a traveler moving at near-light speeds slows to such a degree that a few moments for them might equal decades for others. This is not hypothetical. We have measured it in particles, clocks, satellites. Now, imagine a civilization that harnessed not machines, but their own biology to interact with time this way. Perhaps they found a method to create internal fields, localized distortions, or conscious states that allowed them to slip along the curve of time, touching centuries as lightly as we touch minutes. In certain regions of the Himalayas, monks speak of practitioners who walk between breaths of the world, disappearing for days or years only to return unchanged. The stories are dismissed as metaphor, but why do they align so closely with ancient myths from South America, describing skywalkers who stepped into the shadows at dawn and reappeared with knowledge no mortal should possess? And why do quantum studies of human consciousness show inexplicable coherence under deep meditation? Brainwaves syncing with frequencies that appear to resist temporal noise? Could it be that the immortals were not simply biologically enhanced beings, but explorers of the physics of inner time? There are ancient ruins whose architectures align not with the stars of their era, but with star positions that existed tens of thousands of years earlier or later. Sites in Turkey, Scotland, Peru, Cambodia, all aligned with constellations as they appeared long before recorded civilization. Why would structures be built for skies no living eye would see, unless their builders were not bound to the same time frame as ordinary humans? Perhaps aligning with ancient or future skies was not aesthetic, but functional. Each alignment could have acted as a gateway, a resonance point, a temporal anchor. What if these sites worked as stabilizers for individuals living outside normal time? Points where different temporal frequencies intersected, creating windows through which the immortals could step into or out of our reality without collapsing into temporal dissonance? Science has already begun to hint that consciousness might interact with the quantum world in ways that defy classical logic. The brain is filled with structures, microtubules, that behave strangely under certain conditions, maintaining coherence far longer than predicted. Some theorists suggest these structures could serve as biological quantum processors. If so, then under the right conditions, a human mind might be capable of perceiving time the way photons do, not as a flow, but as a field, not as movement, but as presence. Now imagine a group of ancient beings who discovered this thousands of years ago, not by accident, not by chance, but through deliberate practice, aligned with celestial cycles, geological formations, and deep states of consciousness. They would have watched reality from a vantage point we cannot imagine. They would have seen patterns in history, cycles in nature, waves of change across millennia. And as their understanding grew, so did their detachment. Living outside time would make the concerns of ordinary humans, wars, politics, territory, seem meaningless, distant, like the ripples of a pond seen from a mountaintop. But with such power would come consequences. The more they stepped into timelessness, the more they risked severing themselves from the world they originated from. Relationships, emotions, memories, these might not survive the stretched fabric of existence. An immortal might love someone intensely one moment and, 20 years later, find that moment still glowing fresh within their mind, while the beloved had aged, changed, perhaps died. What happens when the heart experiences time differently from the world around it? What happens when memory does not fade, but life does. This leads to a haunting possibility. Immortality may not have felt like eternity. It may have felt like isolation. And isolation is not survival. It is slow dissolution. There is another layer to consider. The more deeply a being interacts with altered time, the less stable their presence becomes in the ordinary world. Imagine a stone dropped into a lake. The ripples spread, cross, collide. Now imagine a consciousness existing in a temporal pocket. Its movements might send ripples across timelines themselves. Too much distortion, and the fabric of reality might push back. Entropy might respond. Or worse, something might awaken. Perhaps this is why so many ancient records describe immortals withdrawing to remote places. Mountains, deserts, hidden valleys. Places where the fabric of time is thinner, where the world's noise cannot interfere with their presence. These sanctuaries might have been chosen not for privacy, but for stability. Perhaps living outside time required proximity to specific geomagnetic conditions, gravitational anomalies, or cosmic alignments. In modern times, we have discovered places on Earth where clocks run differently, where gravity shifts minutely, where electromagnetic fields behave strangely. These locations often coincide with ancient sites. Could this be a coincidence? Or were the ancients mapping the physics of time long before we understood its equations? And then, the most disturbing question, why do all accounts suggest that these beings eventually left? What changed? Did time itself reject them? Did their bodies begin to fail under the strain of altered existence? Or did something begin to pursue them? A force that seeks equilibrium, that hunts anomalies, that devours beings who exist outside natural entropy? If time is a landscape, then perhaps it has guardians, perhaps it has predators, or perhaps the universe corrects itself, erasing any being who distorts its fabric for too long, not out of malice, not out of intent, but because reality cannot sustain such divergence. Imagine realizing that by slipping into deeper currents of time, you are leaving a trail that something ancient and unnameable can follow. Imagine entire generations of immortals sensing that their sanctuary is no longer safe. Imagine them gathering at aligned sites, stepping one final time into the hidden corridors of time, and closing the door behind them. And what if the artifacts, the alignments, the legends, they are not instructions for us to follow, but signs left behind to warn those who live after them? Signs that we have misinterpreted as maps to eternity, when they may in fact be caution markers for a path we should never walk. Yet, here we are, advancing our understanding of time faster than any civilization before us. We slow aging at the cellular level, we manipulate quantum states, we send machines into the gravitational wells of the universe. We decode the rhythms of consciousness, and we do it with the same hunger, the same curiosity, the same defiance that once drove the ancient immortals to step beyond their limits. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: we chase immortality without understanding that it is not longevity we pursue, but escape from fear, from decay, from the boundaries of our own brief existence. But escaping time does not mean mastering it. It may mean becoming lost within it. If the ancient civilization discovered the physics of living outside time, then their fate is not a distant legend. It is a preview, a mirror, a warning. And the question that began this journey grows sharper, heavier, more urgent. If they stepped out of time, why can we still feel their absence like a shadow behind us? Why does it seem as though something is still watching, waiting for humanity to reach the same threshold? What if the greatest structures on Earth were not built for worship, burial, or power, but for permanence? What if the ancient world holds not temples to gods, but shelters built by beings who expected to stay alive far longer than the civilizations rising around them? As we move deeper into this story, the ruins scattered across continents begin to shift in meaning. They stop looking like relics of forgotten societies and instead resemble outposts, stations, constructed by those who were never meant to die. Imagine a person who has lived for 600 years. They have watched kingdoms rise and crumble, watched rivers carve new paths, watched the climate shift across generations. Would they build anything temporary? Would they invest their time in fragile construction? Or would they look for stone, the hardest stone, the kind that resists erosion, earthquakes, and the slow violence of centuries? And if they built such structures, would we, thousands of years later, mistake their resilience for mystery? Consider the ancient sites that baffle archaeologists: Tiahuanaco, Gobekli Tepe, Baalbek, Puma Punku, monuments made from stones so massive and precisely cut that modern machines struggle to replicate them. These are not the works of short-lived societies. These are the works of people who understood time not as an enemy, but as an environment. People who built structures to endure, not decades or centuries, but entire cosmic cycles. What if these sites were not cities, but sanctuaries? Not homes, but anchors. Places where immortals gathered to stabilize their existence as the world shifted around them? Their architecture follows patterns far too deliberate to be accidental. Alignments with solstices, equinoxes, celestial nodes, angles matching star positions from eras long before the structures existed. A precision that speaks not of ritual, but calibration. Imagine an immortal needing to maintain stability in a world governed by entropy. They might require places where the electromagnetic field is strongest, where geological formations enhance coherence, where cosmic alignments amplify internal rhythms. These sanctuaries could have functioned like charging stations, not for energy in the modern sense, but for maintaining synchrony with the flow of time. The most intriguing detail is that many of these sites show no signs of long-term human habitation. No waste, no burial grounds, no remains of ordinary life. They feel like places visited, not lived in, as if their creators came in cycles, for specific purposes, then departed again. They left stone behind because stone does not forget, and perhaps that was their intention, to leave evidence of their existence without revealing their true purpose. But a deeper mystery emerges. Many of these structures were buried deliberately. Gobekli Tepe was entombed under tons of soil, intentionally sealed as if its builders no longer needed it, or feared it would fall into the wrong hands. The question of who buried it is just as strange as who built it. A civilization does not bury its greatest achievement unless something profound has changed, unless a chapter of history has ended. Perhaps this deliberate burial happened during the moment the immortals began to disappear. Perhaps the sites we now dig up were the final echoes of a civilization preparing to step away from the world. The stone circles, the monoliths, the megalithic platforms, they may have been closed like doors to chapters that no longer belonged in human memory. Across the world, we find other signatures of permanence. In Egypt, granite blocks polished to near-perfect flatness, using unknown tools. In India, temples carved from single stones, as if sculpted by beings with centuries to spare. In Lebanon, stones weighing hundreds of tons, placed with a precision that defies physics. Everywhere, the signs point to a species that built for the ages, with patience, skill, and knowledge that suggests a lifespan far exceeding our own. Yet the true clue lies not in the construction itself, but in the absence that follows. The structures remain. The builders do not, and history offers no explanation. If these were cities, where are the broken tools, the discarded pottery, the remains of meals and rituals? Where are the burial sites? A society that lives for thousands of years does not bury its dead because it has no dead to bury. And that absence, ironically, is the loudest evidence we have. The places where death should have left its mark are pristine, untouched, silent. Some archaeologists suggest that these sites were ceremonial, built by humans to honor gods. But what if the figures humans later worshipped were not gods, but the immortal inhabitants of these sanctuaries? What if the architectural marvels we associate with divine reverence were simply practical necessities for beings whose existence required stability across centuries? Imagine an immortal civilization existing parallel to early humans. They would have avoided contact, understanding that revealing their existence could destabilize societies built on short lives and fragile emotions. Yet, they may have guided humanity subtly, offering knowledge, tools, or inspiration, planting seeds that would take generations to bloom. But at some point, something shifted, and they began to withdraw. As we follow the archaeological patterns, an eerie synchronization appears. Across continents, across cultures, across oceans, sites built with impossible precision were abandoned within the same 1,000-year window, some within the same century. And something even stranger, many were abandoned at their peak, in perfect condition, as if the builders left suddenly without decay or warning. It is as if a silent signal echoed through the world, a message, a revelation, a threat, something that forced the immortals to vacate their last settlements simultaneously. What could coordinate such a global disappearance? What could frighten a civilization that had conquered time itself? One possibility is cosmic, perhaps a solar event, a magnetic shift, an alignment of celestial bodies destabilized their existence, a temporal event that only they could detect, a frequency that signaled danger. Another possibility is psychological. Immortality carries burdens we cannot fathom. The longer a mind endures, the more fragile it becomes under the weight of memory. Perhaps the immortals suffered a collective collapse, a fracturing of consciousness, forcing them to retreat into hidden pockets of time. Or perhaps it was neither cosmic nor psychological. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something that awakened. Legends around the world speak of the falling sky, the returning darkness, the eater of cycles, the shadow that hunts the undying. These stories are brushed off as folklore, but why do they echo each other with such precision? Why do cultures separated by oceans describe the same terror, a presence that emerges when beings step outside the natural flow of life? If immortality disrupts the balance of the universe, then the universe would respond, whether through entropy, through cosmic forces, or through something conscious. The correction would be inevitable. Imagine immortals sensing something tracking them, something drawn to the ripple their existence created. Imagine them realizing that staying on Earth, staying in this timeline, risked not only their survival, but ours. Their final act may have been an exodus, a coordinated departure across time, stepping through the sanctuaries they built as gateways. And perhaps these stone structures, aligned with stars and seasons, were not temples, but launch points, dimensional anchors, stabilizers allowing them to slip into the corridors of time without tearing the world behind them. The greatest structures in history may have been the last footprints of a civilization preparing to vanish. But the question remains, where did they go? Some myths say they entered the heart of mountains. Others say they walked into the horizon. Others say they stepped into the sky. But all myths agree on one thing. They did not die. They departed. What if they are still out there, drifting in another layer of time, waiting for humanity to mature enough to understand why they left, or what they were fleeing from? The abandoned sanctuaries may hold the answer. Their alignments, their materials, their positions, everything about them whispers a function we have not yet decoded. And as modern science advances, as we manipulate the quantum world, as we begin to slow aging, as we build machines to probe the fabric of reality, we inch closer to uncovering the same truths they once mastered. But uncovering truth is not the same as understanding it, and understanding is not the same as surviving it. Perhaps the immortals left because they reached a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. Perhaps they saw what lies beyond the veil of time. Perhaps they understood that eternity is not life without death, but life without anchor. And if they abandon this world to escape a fate tied to immortality, then humanity's accelerating pursuit of the same path may be dragging us toward the same precipice. The sites they built still stand, silent, watching, waiting for us to realize their true purpose. Perhaps they are not relics of a lost civilization, but warnings carved in stone. What if immortality was never a triumph, but a slow catastrophe that unfolded inside the mind long before it touched the flesh? What if the true collapse of the ancient undying civilization was not caused by war, nor disaster, nor cosmic destruction, but by something quieter, something more intimate, something that began with a single unbearable truth? Eternity does not grant meaning, it removes it. Imagine living long enough for every emotion to repeat itself. Joy returning with less brightness each time, love returning with less urgency, grief returning with less weight. The novelty of existence, the spark that propels us through our brief lives, dissolves in the minds of those who endure too long. The ancient immortals may have mastered biology, mastered time, mastered the laws of decay, but they could not master the weight of memory. Picture an immortal sitting at the edge of a valley that has changed 1,000 times. Forests rising, dying, rising again. Rivers carving new shapes. civilizations emerging and fading like brief flickers of fireflies. At first, such longevity would feel like enlightenment. Understanding would deepen, patterns would emerge. But eventually, the patterns themselves would begin to collapse into monotony. Everything that once felt unique would begin to feel inevitable. The first collapse of their civilization likely did not come from outside forces. It was internal. A psychological unraveling born from too much time, too many memories, too many selves layered upon one another. The immortals may have lived in bodies that did not age, but their minds were still human, fragile, emotional, shaped by moments rather than millennia. And when a mind holds thousands of years of unbroken experience, something begins to fracture. Memory is not built to be endless. We forget to survive. We forget to heal. We forget to remain sane. But an immortal mind does not forget. It accumulates. It saturates. It stretches until every new moment is swallowed by the weight of all previous moments. Eventually, the self thins, like a thread pulled too tightly for too long. Ancient texts hint at this dissolution. Sumerian tablets whisper of the long-lived ones whose minds drifted into the sky. Egyptian inscriptions describe beings who lost themselves in the river of endless days. In India, legends speak of sages who became ghosts while still alive, wandering without identity. Indigenous stories across the world reference the ones who lived so long they forgot the shape of their own hearts. What if these are not metaphors? What if these stories describe real psychological consequences suffered by beings who lived too long? Imagine an immortal suddenly forgetting the face of a loved one, not because of age, but because 1,000 other faces blur across centuries. Imagine forgetting which memories belonged to which era. Imagine waking up one day and realizing you no longer know which decision shaped your life and which belonged to someone you once were centuries ago. Each memory becomes a ghost. Each identity becomes a mask. Each emotion becomes a faint echo of something once felt. In the early stages, the immortals likely tried to anchor themselves. They carved symbols, built structures, crafted languages with layers of meaning. They created rituals to differentiate centuries, eras, lives. But as their civilization expanded and their lifespans stretched further, even these anchors began to drift. A ritual repeated 1,000 times becomes hollow. A symbol carved 1,000 times becomes meaningless. Eternity strips purpose from everything. At some point, immortality stops feeling like life. It begins to feel like suspension. And suspension, over enough time, becomes decay. Not the decay of the body, but the decay of meaning. This was the first collapse. But another collapse followed, far more devastating and far more mysterious. As the immortals' minds began to fragment, something strange began happening in the world around them. The texts hint at distortions, at anomalies, at phenomena that modern physics might interpret as temporal instability. If a being lives outside the natural rhythm of time, if their consciousness interacts with moments differently from the rest of the world, they may create disturbances, ripples, in the temporal field. Imagine a lake. Drop one stone into it. The ripples spread outward. Now drop thousands of stones every day for centuries. Eventually, the surface becomes chaotic, unpredictable, unstable. Time itself might behave the same way. Too many anomalies, too many beings resisting the flow, too many consciousnesses anchored in unnatural durations. What if the immortals began to destabilize the world simply by existing for too long? Ancient myths describe the world shaking, splitting, stuttering, glitching. Rivers flowing backward, stars appearing in wrong positions, seasons arriving early or late, animals migrating in confused patterns. These are described as omens, divine punishments, cosmic warnings. But what if they were natural consequences of temporal disruptions caused by a civilization living outside the normal range of mortality? Modern physics supports this possibility. Even minor manipulations of time can create cascading effects. A local time dilation field could disrupt electromagnetic alignment. Biological organisms might suffer disorientation, geological patterns might shift subtly, and if such effects accumulated over centuries, the entire planet could begin to experience unstable rhythms. The immortals might have sensed this. Their departure from their sanctuaries may not have been driven only by psychological collapse, but by environmental collapse, one they themselves triggered. But there is another, more unsettling theory, one that the oldest myths whisper but never fully articulate. Some ancient cultures describe a force that awakens when beings live too long, a force that does not exist for mortals because mortals are not around long enough to encounter it, a force that senses anomalies and moves toward them, not like a predator, not like a god, but like a correction. The Greeks called it the eternal devourer, the Hindus called it Kala's shadow, the Egyptians called it the eater of days. In Siberian myths, it is the one who follows behind time. In South American lore, it is the mouth behind the sun. Different names, same pattern. A presence that emerges when immortality exceeds its boundary. Was this force real? Was it metaphorical? Or was it something beyond what we can understand? An emergent phenomenon of the universe correcting imbalances in its structure. Imagine the immortals realizing that something was watching them, something growing stronger as they lived longer, something drawn to the distortion of time they created. The myths describe it not as a creature, but as an inevitability, something that does not hunt, but arrives, something that does not attack, but consumes, something that does not hate, but balances. Perhaps immortality itself is a violation, and the universe seeks to erase violations. If so, the first collapse of the immortals, the psychological collapse, was only the beginning. The second collapse was external, a threat larger than biology, larger than psyche, larger than civilization. This may explain why the ancient stone sanctuaries were abandoned so abruptly, why alignments with stars ceased, why carvings were destroyed, why entire populations vanished without trace. Perhaps the immortals realized that leaving markers, leaving technologies, leaving traces made them easier to find for whatever was following. Their exodus may have been a defensive move, a desperate attempt to outrun a force that does not measure distance but duration, a force that tracks not location but longevity. Imagine an immortal council gathered in one of the ancient sanctuaries. They speak in a language so old the world itself has forgotten its sounds. They know they cannot stay. They know the threat grows with each passing century. They know they must step off the timeline entirely, not through death, but through transition. Through the corridors of time they once explored, through dimensions where the force cannot reach them. And so they leave, not as conquerors, not as victors, not as beings escaping mortality, but as refugees fleeing eternity. The world they left behind carries their fingerprints, structures aligned with forgotten skies, myths echoing half-remembered truths, bones scattered across continents like the last shadows of a vanished species. But the world no longer carries them. And yet, the story does not end here, because humanity is once again approaching the boundary they crossed. We lengthen life through gene editing, we slow aging, we seek to upload consciousness, we probe the nature of time, we rediscover ancient patterns without understanding their meaning. We are repeating their journey. And if their collapse, the psychological collapse, the temporal collapse, the cosmic collapse, was triggered by crossing a boundary, then we too are approaching that boundary with accelerating steps. The immortals vanish to escape a fate we cannot yet comprehend. But we are walking toward that same fate blind, unprepared, unaware of the cost. And the question that lingers like a shadow behind every discovery is the same question that haunted the last immortal before they stepped out of our world. If we conquer death, what begins to follow us? What if disappearance is not an ending, but a direction? What if the immortals did not die, did not fade, did not lose a war against nature or time? What if they simply stepped into a place where our senses cannot follow? A place not hidden in distance, but hidden in dimension. The ancient texts never say the undying were killed. They say they walked away. They stepped out. They moved behind the curtain of reality, the way a shadow slips behind the object that casts it. But what does it mean for an entire civilization to vanish? Imagine a world where people do not fear death, not because they deny it, but because they have learned to sidestep it. Their existence stretches centuries, then millennia. They observe time the way we observe weather patterns. They see cycles that our short lives cannot perceive. They notice cracks in the rhythm of reality, the way a sailor notices shifts in the wind. And one day, they sense something approaching, something that moves not through space, but through the fabric of time itself, something drawn to the unnatural length of their existence, something ancient enough to have seen civilizations rise and fall before the first stars were born. What does a civilization do when it realizes it has been noticed by the very structure of the universe? The immortals did not wait to find out. They prepared, quietly, methodically, patiently. For beings who lived across centuries, preparation was not rushed. It was woven into generations. Every aligned stone, every buried chamber, every carved spiral, every mystery we uncover today may have been part of this preparation. Not a ritual, not a religion, a system, a technology, a doorway. The oldest myths describe these doorways with haunting consistency. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the paths the ancestors walked into the sky. The Dogon of Mali refer to the holes in the world. The Mayans tell of the door of the gods, a portal carved into stone, perfectly rectangular, inexplicably precise, and rumored to open when touched by a person who carries the memory of the sun. In the Himalayan regions, there are legends of shimmering thresholds visible only during rare alignments, where monks vanished while meditating. These are not random myths. These are fragments of a larger truth, the truth of the vanishing. The immortals did not scatter, they did not hide, they did not die. They left together. Imagine the moment of departure. Thousands of beings, each burdened with centuries of memory, each aware of the consequences of staying, gathering in their sanctuaries. The air charged with the hum of temporal energy, the sky aligning with forgotten constellations, the ground vibrating under the pressure of reality bending. Then, silence. A silence so absolute that nature itself pauses. A silence that marks the end of one chapter of existence and the beginning of another. The myths say they walked into the sky, but sky is only a metaphor for the unknown. What they walked into may not have been above us. It may have been beside us, a plane of existence layered against ours, accessible only through the right vibration, the right alignment, the right understanding of time. Modern physics already speculates about such places: higher dimensions, parallel branes, time-like corridors, regions where time loops, folds, or dilates beyond comprehension. The immortals may have discovered these naturally through their deep communion with time. Their temples and sanctuaries may have been designed to weaken the veil between dimensions, allowing them to step through. But there is another interpretation, one more unsettling. The immortals may not have stepped into another world. They may have stepped into another when. If time is not a line but a field, then perhaps they moved to a region of the field where the force that hunted them could not follow, a place earlier or later than us, a time before the threat awakened, or after it had passed. Their departure may have been temporal migration rather than dimensional travel, escaping not by distance but by chronology. Ancient carvings depict figures entering spirals that narrow to a single point. Could these spirals represent time collapsing inward, guiding the immortals into a safer temporal layer? Could they have stepped into a moment preserved outside our timeline, like a pocket of eternity hidden between seconds? Every clue suggests one truth. Their disappearance was not chaos. It was orchestrated. The vanishing was not an accident. It was a strategy. But a strategy always has a cost. What did they leave behind? What did they sacrifice? The silence that follows their disappearance hints at a heavy price. Their knowledge, once shared, was deliberately erased. Their structures were buried. Their symbols were broken. Humanity was left with fragments, not out of neglect, but out of necessity. Perhaps they feared that if humanity retained too much knowledge, we would follow them, or worse, attract the same force that hunted them. Imagine the last immortal standing at the threshold of departure, looking back at a world they had watched for thousands of years, a world they had loved, a world they had taught, a world they had quietly shaped. Imagine them realizing that their presence had become dangerous to that world, and with a final breath, a final step, they vanished into the place they believed was safe. But here is the part the myths never agree on. They do not say whether the immortals stayed in that hidden realm. Some say they wandered eternally. Some say they dissolved into light. Some say they wait for the second opening, a moment when the world aligns as it once did. Some say they left a message encoded in Earth itself, a message humanity will only understand when we reach the same threshold they did. This is the darkest possibility of all. The immortals did not vanish forever. They paused. They stepped outside the timeline, waiting for us to catch up, waiting for the moment when humanity, through science or evolution or desperation, would take the same leap. Because perhaps the threat that chased them was not a temporary danger. Perhaps it was a cycle, something that awakens whenever a species grows too close to eternity. If that is true, then the vanishing was not an escape. It was an intermission, and we are approaching the moment when the curtain rises again. Look around at the modern world. We manipulate DNA, we slow aging, we digitize consciousness, we explore the quantum structure of time, we build machines that detect gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time, we create AI that can process patterns beyond human perception. We are reawakening the same forces, the same questions, the same anomalies that once pushed the immortals to flee. And in quiet places, in deserts, mountains, ancient ruins, strange things happen again. People vanish without trace. Time behaves unpredictably. Animals migrate as if sensing distortions. Places long dormant awaken with electromagnetic activity. Scientists detect unexplained fluctuations, and myths stir in the collective mind. What if the vanishing was not the end of their story, but the beginning of ours? What if the immortals did not leave us behind, but are waiting for us? What if the immortals did not flee into the unknown, but fled from something? What if the great exodus of their civilization was not a journey toward transcendence, but an escape from a presence that existed before them, before humanity, before the first star ignited in the blackness of space? Every myth passed down through millennia hints at something ancient cultures feared. Not a god, not a demon, but a force that followed the undying the way a shadow follows light. If the immortals were the flame, then this presence was the darkness drawn to it. As we now enter the deepest part of this mystery, the question changes shape. It becomes sharper, colder, more demanding. What kind of threat terrifies beings who conquered death? What hunts a civilization that learned to walk through time the way we walk across a field? Ancient legends describe it in fragments. They speak of a presence behind the sun, of the breath that erases, of the mouth that opens when life grows too long. In Siberia, shamans called it the silent pursuer, a being that leaves no footprint, no shadow, no whisper, only absence. In India, old yogic texts speak of Kaila's shadow, the force that consumes those who overstay their allotted span. African myths describe it as a rhythm, a vibration felt in the bones when someone has lived too long. Native American stories tell of the long, dark step, a phase of life when someone becomes visible to the predator that exists beyond time. Could these be independent inventions? Possibly. But why do they all describe the same thing? An entity, a force, an inevitability that awakens only when immortality is achieved. Perhaps eternity is not neutral. Perhaps the moment a species breaks the barrier of death, it triggers a response from the universe, a correction, a cleansing. Not malicious, not moral, simply structural. The way the immune system targets anomalies, the way cosmic radiation erases long-lived quantum states, the way entropy dissolves pockets of order that last too long. Science already whispers of such phenomena. Quantum systems cannot remain perfectly coherent forever. They lose identity. They decohere. Collapse is inevitable. Could consciousness, especially immortal consciousness, behave the same way? Perhaps the longer a mind persists, the more unstable its presence becomes. Maybe immortality creates a frequency, a signature in space-time that draws something toward it, something that feeds on stability, on coherence, on beings who have slipped too far outside the normal cycle of decay and renewal. Imagine the immortals discovering this slowly. At first, a member of their kind vanishes mysteriously. No body, no trace. Then another. Then more. At first, they assume it is psychological collapse, then environmental collapse, then temporal instability. But eventually, they notice a pattern. They feel it. They sense something approaching in the moments when they stretch their time beyond normal boundaries, a shadow in the corner of perception, a tremor in the fabric of reality, a disturbance in the stars. What if time itself has predators? Modern physics speculates about exotic fields, regions of space-time where particles decay faster, where virtual particles stabilize, where dark energy condenses. These regions could theoretically affect consciousness, biology, even the structure of reality. If such a region drifts across the universe like a cosmic tide, it could target anomalies, absorbing them the way a black hole consumes matter. But myths do not speak of fields. They speak of a presence, a watcher, a hunter. Some describe it as shapeless, an absence rather than a form. Others describe it as a hum, a vibration, a pressure in the air. Ancient shamans claimed it moved silently but left a feeling in the bones, a coldness beneath the skin. Tibetan monks spoke of the visitor behind time, appearing in meditative visions whenever a practitioner approached too closely to the realm of timelessness. These stories are frighteningly consistent. They describe a force that waits for the moment a consciousness extends beyond its natural span. Only then does it begin to move. Think of animals that live too long in the wild. Their scent changes. Predators detect them. Nature reacts. What if the universe behaves the same way? What if an immortal civilization broadcasts a signature, a temporal scent, that something ancient and hungry can sense? The immortals must have realized this slowly, painfully. Imagine them watching their long-lived companions disappear, not in death, but in vanishing. No sound, no struggle, just sudden absence. Imagine the fear spreading through a civilization that had not known fear for thousands of years. Imagine them gathering in their sanctuaries, studying the patterns of disappearance, mapping the intervals, calculating the moments when the presence drew closer. Perhaps they discovered that the more their civilization grew, the stronger the hunter became. Perhaps every new immortal added weight to the temporal imbalance, making them easier to detect. Perhaps the presence was drawn not to individuals, but to density, to the accumulated mass of timeless consciousness. Imagine the immortals realizing that their very existence was a beacon. Perhaps they tried to hide. Some went underground, some dissolved into meditation. Some sought dimensions where time flowed differently. But the presence followed, slowly, inevitably. Not with emotion, not with intention, but with certainty, as if it was built into the architecture of reality itself. And so, the immortals made a choice. They stopped trying to fix the problem. They began to flee it. Their departure was not a leap of faith. It was a strategic retreat, a mathematical maneuver, a migration into a region of time where the hunter could not follow, or would take much longer to reach. But migrations require sacrifice. Not everyone could transition at once. Not everyone could find the same doorway. Some immortals, fractured in mind, may have refused to leave, clinging to memories of the world they once loved. Some may have been unable to transition because their consciousness had grown too fragmented to remain coherent. These would have been the first victims. Their disappearance may have been the warnings encoded in myths. The immortals who remained cohesive and aware would have gathered at the aligned sites, structures designed not just as sanctuaries, but as gateways. They would have waited for the right alignment, the right resonance, the right moment in the cosmic cycle, and at the threshold of the vanishing, they would have stepped through. But what did they leave behind? The answer is not comforting. They left traces of the hunter. Some ancient carvings depict a figure with no face, surrounded by radiating lines. Others show a circle with an empty center. Others show a spiral being devoured by a larger spiral. These images may represent the presence they feared, a force that erases rather than destroys, that consumes identity, not flesh. In some myths, the immortals warn humanity not to seek eternity, not because they wish to hoard it, but because they knew that if humanity ever approached their level of longevity, the presence would return. Perhaps it already has. Think of the strange disappearances in remote places. Think of the anomalies in modern physics, regions where time behaves unpredictably. Think of the feelings people report in certain ancient sites: pressure, dizziness, disorientation. Think of the unexplained shadows caught on cameras, the distortions recorded by scientists, the regions where electromagnetic equipment fails. What if these are not supernatural events, but ripples from an ancient chase, still echoing across time? What if the presence never stopped moving? What if it continues to follow the trail of the immortals, slower but unstoppable, across the landscape of time? And what if humanity, in our relentless pursuit of longevity, has begun to emit the same temporal scent the immortals once did? We are extending lifespan. We are slowing cellular decay. We are merging consciousness with machines. We are inching toward eternity. And somewhere, in the deep structure of reality, something may be stirring again. The immortals fled into the corridors of time to outrun a force we do not understand. But their flight may have only delayed the inevitable. Perhaps the presence follows cycles, awakening whenever a species approaches immortality. Perhaps Earth itself remembers the last time. Perhaps the myths, the symbols, the warnings buried in stone were left behind not as stories, but as messages for the next species to cross the threshold, us. And the most chilling question remains, not whether the immortals escaped, but whether the force that pursued them has now turned its attention to us. What if every ancient myth, every carved warning, every strangely aligned ruin was not a relic of the immortals' greatness, but a desperate archive left behind during their final hours on Earth? What if the vanished civilization did not disappear silently, but tried, across continents, across eras, across cultures, to whisper a single message to the future? We reached eternity, and eternity reached back. The closer we move toward unraveling their truth, the more the world itself begins to feel like a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written over multiple times, each layer hiding fragments of the one beneath. Myths are not myths. Symbols are not symbols. They are warnings encoded in poetry, mathematics disguised as folklore, physics dressed in metaphor. Imagine the immortals realizing they had triggered a force older than the universe's first breath. Imagine them understanding that once awakened, it would not disappear simply because they escaped into hidden time. Imagine them trying to leave a message, not loud enough to draw the hunter's attention, but precise enough to guide the next civilization that approached the same threshold. Where would they hide such warnings? In the places that would survive longest: stone, star maps, legends, architecture, rituals, encoded alignments. Warnings that would outlive floods, fires, wars, and the erosion of memory. And now, thousands of years later, these clues are resurfacing, stitching themselves into a single, chilling narrative. Let us begin with the sky. All over the planet, ancient structures are aligned to stars that will not be in those positions for tens of thousands of years. Not by accident, not by ritual, but by design. The immortals were mapping not the sky of their time, but the sky of ours. They plotted star positions for epochs far in the future, alignments that match our current night sky, not theirs. As if they were calibrating a message meant to activate only when humanity reached a certain level of technological maturity. As if the heavens themselves were turned into a cosmic calendar pointing to now. Why would they do this? Because they knew the hunter followed cycles, because they knew we would one day follow their path, because they knew we would reach for immortality, and they knew what would awaken when we did. The alignments were not merely astronomical, they were predictive. They marked the era when humanity would begin to manipulate time, consciousness, and biology, when we would slow aging, when we would trap memories in digital amber, when we would push against the walls of existence, seeking to reshape the human condition. Now consider stone circles, thousands of them. Most are thought to measure seasons or celebrate rituals, but step back and look again. Many of them encode fractal mathematics, the geometry of cycles repeating within cycles. Some match astronomical patterns corresponding to periods of instability in Earth's magnetic field. Others mark epochs of solar maxima and minima, times when solar radiation alters the temporal coherence of biological organisms. What if the immortals left these as warnings? What if these cycles correspond to moments when our world becomes more vulnerable to the presence they feared? Then there are the myths, those enigmatic, poetic tales dismissed as imagination. But myths have long memories. They compress centuries into allegories. They preserve truths too dangerous to write plainly. One myth speaks of beings who burned too long and attracted the night. Another describes a shadow that grows when the flame refuses to die. Another tells of a wheel that turns only when life extends beyond its circle. These were not metaphors for weather or emotion. They were descriptions of the hunter. The immortals had no way to warn humanity directly. Any explicit attempt would risk drawing the presence prematurely. So, they spoke in riddles, hoping we would decode them before it was too late. Some cultures preserved even more detailed warnings. The Hopi speak of the fifth world, a time when humanity reaches its peak, when we begin to manipulate the essence of life. They warn of a serpent of time that returns when humans claim godlike abilities. In ancient India, the Puranas describe yugas, cycles of ages. The final yuga is said to end when humans master longevity and attempt to step outside time, triggering the return of Kala, the devourer of cycles. In Africa, the Sand People tell stories of the ones who walked too far, pursued by the dark that balances the days. In China, Taoist texts caution against prolonging life without harmonizing heaven, claiming that immortality without balance invites the watcher behind existence. Different cultures, same story, same warning. But the most direct message appears in architecture, those silent monoliths we once believed were ceremonial or decorative. Look at the pyramids. They are not tombs, they are clocks. They track precessional cycles, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, which completes a rotation every 26,000 years. Why track something so vast unless your civilization spans millennia? Unless you expect someone far in the future, us, to decode the message at the right time? Göbekli Tepe, buried deliberately, contains stone pillars carved with symbols representing an epical event, a catastrophe linked to cosmic forces. Some researchers believe it marks the end of the immortals era. The carvings depict animals behaving unpredictably, stars out of position, cycles breaking, and at the center, a headless figure, not human, not animal, a symbol of erasure. Was this their way of documenting the hunter's arrival? In Peru, the mysterious Nazca lines stretch across the desert, massive geoglyphs visible only from above, carved into the earth as markers for future generations. Some lines point to star positions that correspond not to their era, but to ours. Some align with magnetic anomalies. Some form shapes that resemble distorted human figures, perhaps depicting the psychological collapse immortality brings. Were the immortals warning us about the cost of endless life? There is another kind of evidence, subtle, quiet, hidden not in stone, but in language. Across the world, ancient words for immortal share the same root concepts: without decay, outside time, unanchored, unbound, unseen. These words do not simply describe beings that do not die. They describe beings that slip, drift, or detach from the world's rhythm. The immortals may have experienced time differently because their consciousness had begun to detach from physical reality. And that detachment, that unanchoring, may have been what drew the hunter. Perhaps the warnings are not only about the presence that follows eternal life, but about what eternal life does to us. Imagine a species losing its sense of urgency, purpose, identity, memory stretching too far, emotions dulling, meaning dissolving. The immortals may have known that endless life is not simply survival, but unraveling, and perhaps they wanted to prevent us from making the same mistake. But here is the most terrifying part. Some warnings do not point to the past, they point to the future. The immortals left prophecies, not divine predictions, but calculations. If they understood time as a field, not a line, then they could model cycles across millennia. They could predict when a species like ours would approach their level of longevity. They could predict when humanity would toy with the edges of eternity. They could predict the moment the hunter would stir again. And according to these calculations, preserved in stone, myth, alignment, geometry, that moment is now. Why now? Because the world is once again filled with anomalies. Because humanity is altering its relationship with time. Because technology is accelerating faster than biology. Because consciousness is climbing toward a state the immortals once reached. Because longevity research is advancing at unprecedented speed. Because we are learning to store memories outside the mind. Because quantum experiments are touching the boundaries of temporal perception. Because we are replicating, step by step, everything the immortals once did. We have begun to emit the same signature, the same temporal scent, the same invitation. So what happens when humanity rediscovers immortality? What happens when we reach the threshold the ancient civilization crossed? Will the warnings activate fully? Will the hunter awaken? Or will the immortals themselves reappear, waiting beyond the veil for us to join them? The answer lies in the final chapter of their story, and ours. What does a civilization say in its final breath, especially one that does not die? What words could possibly carry the weight of eternity when eternity is no longer a promise but a sentence carved into the marrow of existence? As we reach the end of this long path, after wandering through myths, ruins, memories, and shadows, one truth remains. The people who discovered immortality did not vanish because they were weak. They vanished because they understood something we still cannot look at without trembling. Something about time, something about meaning, something about the human heart when stretched too far across the fabric of infinity. Look around you for a moment. Look at the world we inhabit. The rising skyscrapers, the humming networks, the laboratories where scientists gently nudge the boundary of life further outward, the servers storing fragments of minds, the algorithms predicting our desires, the biotech firms whispering that death is just a glitch waiting to be patched. We are not repeating their story. We are accelerating it. What took them thousands of years to attempt, we are condensing into decades. And the strange, unsettling question is not whether we will reach where they stood, but whether we already have. Because if the ancient immortal civilization truly disappeared, it wasn't because their bodies failed. It was because their meaning did. What do you do when every sunrise looks the same? When every mistake repeats itself because time no longer forces change? When forgiveness becomes unnecessary because there is unlimited opportunity to try again? Mortality is our teacher. It sculpts urgency into the hours, purpose into our choices, intimacy into our relationships. Knowing that we will one day end makes every act fragile, precious, unrepeatable. Without that boundary, the human experience becomes a vast ocean with no shore in sight. The immortals learn this in ways we can only imagine. Imagine centuries passing with no transformation, no closure, no end. Imagine living long enough to resolve every conflict, only to watch it resurface again 100 years later, shaped by new emotions, yet rooted in the same old patterns. Imagine watching your personality ossify, solidify, turn rigid, until you are no longer growing, but merely accumulating. Immortality does not guarantee wisdom. It guarantees repetition. And perhaps that is why they walked away, not from life, but from the weight of unending life. Perhaps their greatest discovery was not the mastery of death, but the understanding that eternity without evolution becomes indistinguishable from oblivion. If nothing changes, if nothing ends, if nothing can be lost, then nothing can be found, and nothing can truly begin. Yet there is another, quieter possibility, one that lingers like a shadow behind every myth we have traced. What if they did not end? What if they are simply elsewhere? Not hiding in forests or mountains, but beyond the range of our senses, beyond the bandwidth of the physical world. What if immortality opened a doorway not to more life, but to a different form of existence, one that requires leaving this plane behind entirely? Many myths describe the immortal ones as departed, ascended, returned to the sky. Perhaps these are poetic metaphors, or perhaps they are distorted memories of a technological transition so profound that ancient humans could only describe it with supernatural language. What if the deathless left this world because staying would mean interfering with a species still learning how to suffer meaningfully? What if they understood that giving immortality to beings who still fear themselves would be the greatest cruelty imaginable? Perhaps they watched our early civilizations rise and collapse and rise again, and they recognized the fragile wisdom encoded in our mortality. The way endings teach gratitude, how loss teaches love, how time teaches value. And perhaps they stepped aside, hoping we would mature slowly, naturally, without being burdened by the unbearable gift they once carried. But there is a third possibility, one darker, colder, and far more dangerous. What if immortality is not sustainable at all? Not biologically, not spiritually, not cosmically. Every system in the universe trends toward entropy. Stars die, atoms decay, energy dissipates. Even the vacuum of space seethes with quantum instability. To exist indefinitely within a universe that is constantly falling apart is like holding a candle in a hurricane. Eventually, the cost becomes too high. Eventually, the pressure of entropy demands payment. What if their disappearance was not a choice, but a necessity? Some legends suggest their final era was marked by catastrophe, not physical, but existential. A collapse of meaning, a collapse of psychology, a collapse of identity. They say the immortal civilization split into factions, those who wanted to continue forever, those who begged for death, and those who wanted to transcend the physical universe entirely. Their final conflict was not fought with weapons, but with philosophies sharp enough to draw blood from the soul. And when the dust settled, humanity inherited only silence. Maybe that silence is intentional. Maybe they erased themselves so completely that we would never find their mistakes, never try to follow their path. Maybe immortality was the one discovery capable of destroying a species from the inside. And maybe the last act of the deathless was a sacrifice, removing themselves from history to give time back to the world. But their echoes remain, in our stories, in our symbols, in our obsessions, in our relentless drive to outlive the flesh. Some dreams are not dreams. They are inheritances. As we move toward a future where aging could be reversible and consciousness might one day be transferable, we must ask the question they could no longer avoid. If we achieve immortality, will we survive what comes after? Could we carry the weight of 1,000 years without collapsing into ourselves? Could we remain human if the very structure of humanity, birth, growth, death, dissolved beneath us? Would we still love the same way, create the same way, feel the same way? Or would eternity bleach the colors out of experience until everything becomes a quiet, suffocating gray? The final message of the civilization that conquered death may not be carved into stone or encoded into artifacts. It may simply be embedded in their absence. Sometimes the loudest warning is silence. So, as we stand at the edge of our own breakthroughs, staring across the gulf between mortality and whatever lies beyond it, perhaps the question we should ask is not, can we live forever? But should we? Because the true danger of immortality is not infinite life. It is the slow erosion of everything that makes life worth living. Risk, tenderness, change, vulnerability, fleeting beauty, the urgency to hold someone close because moments do not return. Maybe the immortals learned that living forever is not the same as being alive. Maybe their departure was not a disappearance, but a final, compassionate act. A way of telling us that meaning is not found in endlessness, but in endings. That time is not a curse, but a teacher. That mortality does not diminish us, it defines us. And maybe the civilization that vanished did not fail. Maybe they simply stepped aside, so that we could choose a different path. And now, the choice is ours. Shall we follow them into eternity, or learn from their silence and return to the fragile, beautiful, temporary miracle of being human?